Reference. Chapter 10. East Asians. 1. Intelligence of indigenous East Asians. 2. East Asians in the United States. 3. Further studies of East Asians outside East Asia. 4. East Asians adopted by Europeans. 5. East Asian-European hybrids. 6. Reaction times. 7. Visual memory. 8. Brain size. 9. Heritability of intelligence in East Asians. 10. Environmental and genetic explanations of the East Asian IQ. EAST Asians are the indigenous peoples of present-day China, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, and Tibet. They have frequently been described as Mongoloids and have been recognized as one of the major races in classical anthropology from the first taxonomies of Linnaeus and Blumenbach, and are one of the 7 major races in the classification proposed by Kuhn, Garn, and Birdsell. Their identity as a genetic cluster has been confirmed by Cavalli, Sforza, Minozzi, and Piazza in their classification, based on a number of genetic markers taken from samples of Samoyeds, Mongols, Tibetans, Koreans, and Japanese. The most distinctive features of East Asians are their straight black hair, flat nose, and yellowish skin color, and the epicanthic eye fold that gives their eyes a narrow appearance. 1. Intelligence of indigenous East Asians. Studies of the intelligence of indigenous East Asians have been made in China, Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and also Singapore, where ethnic Chinese make up 76% of the population. The results of these studies are summarized in Table 10.1. Rows 1 to 10 give results for the People's Republic of China. Row 1 gives an IQ of 107 from a standardization of the WISC-R in Shanghai. This figure is probably a little high for China because the IQ in Shanghai is likely to be higher than in China as a whole. Row 2 gives an IQ of 103 for several reasoning tests for 14 and 15-year-olds obtained in the mid-1990s. Row 3 gives an IQ of 101, calculated from a standardization of the standard progressive matrices in China for the age range from 6 to 15. Row 4 gives an IQ of 104 for 12 and 18-year-olds in Shanghai compared with Americans in Missouri and Georgia. On 10 arithmetic tests of computation and arithmetical reasoning, the Chinese scored higher by an average of 1.37D, the equivalent of 20 IQ points. This study also reports a comparison of the performance of elderly Chinese and Americans in which the Chinese obtained a lower mean IQ than the Americans by 8 IQ points. No information is given of how representative the sampling was, and the result is not considered sufficiently reliable for entry in the table. Row 5 gives an IQ of 109 for a test of arithmetical reasoning for sample of 4-year-old preschool children in Beijing, compared with the sample of 156 American children. Row 6 gives an IQ of 103 for a drawing test of a person and a horse resembling the Draw a Man test. The Chinese children were at school in Beijing and were compared with a sample of 489 British children. Row 7 gives an IQ of 107 for a combined sample of urban and rural children. Row 8 gives an IQ of 103 for a sample of 17-year-olds at high school in Shanghai compared with a sample of 55 American high school students in Columbia, Missouri. Row 9 gives an IQ of 113 for a sample of college students at the East China Normal University in Shanghai compared with a sample of 239 American college students at the University of Missouri. Row 10 gives an IQ of 107 for a sample of 7 to 8-year-olds at school in Beijing. Rows 11 through 19 give 9 results from Hong Kong. Row 11 gives an IQ of 105 obtained from the Culture Fair test for a representative sample of Chinese 9 to 11-year-olds attending 5 primary schools. Row 12 gives an IQ of 106 obtained for a large sample of 16-year-olds on the AH4 test. There are no satisfactory British norms for this age for this test, so the comparison group is a sample of Canadian 16-year-olds. Rows 13 through 16 give IQs of 109, 103, 110, and 108, obtained from the standard progressive matrices. Row 16 gives results for 10-year-olds in which reasoning ability was measured with the SPM, spatial ability with the space relations test from the primary mental abilities test, and verbal ability by word fluency. This study shows an exaggerated version of the typical East Asian pattern of high reasoning IQ, higher spatial IQ, and weaker verbal IQ. Row 17 gives an IQ of 104 obtained from the Culture Fair test. Row 18 gives the unusually high IQ of 122 for a sample of 9-year-olds. Row 19 gives a closely similar IQ of 120 for the Advanced Progressive Matrices Hong Kong standardization sample, which appears to have been exceptionally well drawn. Rows 20 through 42 give IQs for studies in Japan. Row 20 gives a Japanese IQ of 102 calculated from the Japanese standardization sample of the Wariski and based on 5 performance tests and digit span. The visualization IQ of 102 is calculated from the block design and mazes subtests. Row 21 also gives a Japanese IQ of 102. Calculated from the standardization sample of the Ways and based on digit symbol, block design, and digit span, the only tests that were unaltered in the Japanese version of the test. Row 22 gives a Japanese IQ of 107 for 5 to 10-year-olds on the MFFT calculated from error scores compared with an American sample numbering 2,676. Row 23 gives a Japanese IQ of 106 for 10-year-olds obtained on the Japanese Kyoto test compared with British children. Row 24 gives an IQ of 108 for a sample of children in Hiroshima for the arithmetic subtest of the RAT. Row 25 gives an IQ of 112 for Japanese children in Nagoya and Hamamatsu. Row 26 gives an IQ of 107 obtained from the Japanese standardization sample of the Columbia Mental Maturity Scale. Row 27 gives results of the study by Stevenson and his colleagues that compared 6 and 11-year-olds of samples drawn from the cities of Minneapolis in the United States, Sendai in Japan, and Taipei in Taiwan. While Sendai and Taipei may be acceptable as broadly representative of urban children in Japan and Taiwan, the same cannot be said of Minneapolis as representative of American cities. Minneapolis is the principal city in Minnesota, and there is considerable evidence that the intelligence level is higher in Minnesota than in the United States as a whole. In the military draft in World War I, the whites from Minnesota obtained the highest score on the Army beta test of all American states. In the military draft for the Korean War, the percentage found unacceptable in Minnesota for military service on account of low intelligence was the second lowest among the American states. Table 10.1. IQs of Indigenous East Asians, indicative of a high average intelligence level. In the NAEP math test of 8th grade students in 2003, Minnesota achieved the highest score of all the American states. Flynn has calculated that the mean IQ of whites in Minnesota is 105. This is accepted as the best estimate. Hence, for a comparison with an American white IQ of 100, 5 IQ points need to be added to the samples from Japan and Taiwan, giving them an IQ of 105 consistent with the results of numerous other studies. Row 28 gives a general IQ of 103 derived from the Japanese standardization samples of the WISC-R, a verbal IQ of 100 based on the 5 verbal subtests, and a visualization IQ of 104 based on the block design subtest. Row 29 gives a general IQ of 103 derived from the Japanese standardization sample of the WPAPSI, a verbal IC, of 97 based on 5 verbal subtests, and a visualization IQ of 109 based on 4 performance subtests. Row 30 gives IQs of 103 for reasoning, 103 for verbal, and 107 for visualization ability obtained from the administration of the Kyoto test to a representative sample of British children. The 3 IQs have been averaged to give an IQ of 104 for general IQ. Row 31 gives IQs of 104 for reasoning, and 114 for visualization ability obtained from the administration of the DAT to a sample of Japanese 13 to 15-year-olds. Row 32 gives a general IQ of 103, IQs of 102 for sequential processing, and 105 for simultaneous processing, calculated from the Japanese standardization sample of the MEC-C-Carthy test. Row 33 gives an IQ of 103 derived from Kaufman et al.'s analyses of the Japanese WISC-R standardization sample for Kaufman sequential and simultaneous factors. Sequential processing correlated 0.4 with the Wechsler verbal IQ, and simultaneous processing correlated 0.73 with the Wechsler performance IQ. The two IQs are averaged to give a measure of G. In addition, the test contains a matrix analogies test similar to the progressive matrices, the results of which are entered in the table under reasoning. Row 34 gives an IQ of 113 for a sample of adolescents in school in Keio compared with 121 American students in school in Florida. The verbal IQ of 116 is calculated from a test of arithmetic, and the visualization IQ of 110 from tests of mental rotation and mazes. Row 35 gives an IQ of 110 for a sample of 9-year-old children in Tokyo. Row 36 compares Japanese children in the city of Nagoya with Canadian norms on the Canadian Cognitive Abilities Test. The mean Japanese reasoning IQ of 106 is typical of a number of other studies, but the Japanese verbal IQ of 121 is an unusually high figure for Japanese children. This study also found a quantitative IQ of 112 for Japanese children. The children's age range was 5 to 7 years, and the advantage of the Japanese 5-year-olds was as great as that of the 6 to 7-year-olds. The 5-year-olds were at kindergarten. The high IQs obtained by Japanese 5-year-olds makes it improbable that the Japanese advantage can be an effect of more efficient schooling, as proposed by Stevenson et al. Row 37 compares Japanese children in the medium-sized city of Matsuyama with American norms on the matrix analogies test, and gives the Japanese children a mean IQ of 105. Row 38 gives an IQ of 103 for reasoning and 109 for visualization obtained for 14 to 15-year-olds as averages of several tests in the mid-1990s. This result is part of the same study that found an IQ of 103 for children of the same age in China, suggesting that by the mid-1990s the IQs of Chinese and Japanese children were the same. Row 39 gives a verbal IQ of 100, derived from a general knowledge test given to 6 and 17-year-olds in the Japanese city of Sendai compared with the American city of Minneapolis. Because the mean IQ of whites in Minneapolis is estimated at 105, as explained in the comment on row 27, the Japanese mean has been raised by 5 IQ points. Row 40 gives a visualization IQ of 102 obtained by comparing a sample of Japanese high school and university students with a sample of 52 European students at University College, Dublin. Row 41 gives an IQ of 102 obtained for Japanese 7 and 11-year-olds compared with a matched sample of 60 British children. Row 42 gives a verbal IQ of 105 derived from a general knowledge test comparing Japanese 17-year-olds with Americans in Minneapolis. The Japanese mean has been raised by 5 IQ points for the reason given in the comment on row 38. Rows 43 and 44 give results for Singapore. Row 43 gives an IQ of 107 for a sample of 13-year-olds. Row 44 gives an IQ of 114 for 15-year-olds obtained from the advanced progressive matrices and is substantially higher, although it is not so high as the 2 last studies from Hong Kong. Rows 45 through 48 give 4 results for South Korea. Row 45 gives an IQ of 113 derived from the standardization sample of the Kaufman K-ABC test, an exceptionally well-constructed and standardized American test. This study shows the typical East Asian pattern of high reasoning IQ obtained from a matrix analogies test, high spatial IQ, and weaker verbal IQ. Row 46 gives an IQ of 109 and a similar pattern of lower verbal than visualization abilities. Row 47 gives an IQ of 103 for a socially representative sample of 4-year-olds at preschool in the region. of Busan compared with 156 American children. Row 48 gives an IQ of 100 based on the standardization sample of WISC-3. Rows 49 through 59 give 11 results for Taiwan. Row 49 gives an IQ of 102 obtained from an early result in the 1950s. Rows 50, 51, and 52 give IQs of 102, 110, and 105 obtained by primary school children. Row 53 gives an IQ of 107 for a sample of children in Taipei for the arithmetic subtest of the RAT. Row 54 gives an IQ of 104 obtained from a comparison of Taiwanese children with an American sample in Minneapolis, where the mean IQ of whites is estimated at 105, so the Taiwanese mean has been raised by 5 IQ points. Row 55 gives an IQ of 105 for 6 to 8 year old primary school children in Taipei and country towns and villages. Row 56 gives an IQ of 100 for a general information or knowledge test given to samples from the United States and Taipei in Taiwan. General knowledge is a component of verbal intelligence, as shown in numerous factor analyses of the Wechsler tests, and the results are entered under verbal IQ. Rows 57 and 58 give IQs of 105 for nonverbal reasoning. Row 59 gives an IQ of 107 for a general knowledge test given to samples in the United States and Taipei. The Taiwanese sample scored 2 IQ points higher than the American, but the American sample was taken from the city of Minneapolis, where the mean IQ of whites is estimated at 105, so the Taiwanese mean has been raised by 5 IQ points to 107. The median IQ of the 11 studies from Taiwan is 105. 2 conclusions can be drawn from the studies summarized in Table 10.1. The first is that all the East Asian IQs are a little higher than those of Europeans, except for the Chen et al. Studies of general information in Japan and Taiwan, and the Jorges et al. Result for South Korea, all of which give East Asians an IQ of 100. The range of IQs is between 100 and 122. The median IQ of the studies is 105 and should be taken as the best estimate of the IQs of indigenous East Asians. Second, 11 of the studies contain measures of verbal and visualization abilities, and in 10 of these the visualization IQ is greater than the verbal IQ. The mean and median differences between the two abilities are both 12 IQ points. This difference appears in a variety of tests. The finding of the stronger visualization abilities and weaker verbal abilities of East Asians as compared with Europeans is so consistently present and is so large that it appears to be a real phenomenon. 2. East Asians in TBE United States. East Asians have settled in a number of countries, including the United States, Canada, Europe, Brazil, and Malaysia. By far the greatest number of studies of the intelligence of East Asians outside East Asia have been made in the United States. These have been summarized and discussed by Vernon and Flynn. Vernon concluded that American ethnic East Asians have a verbal IQ of 97 and an IQ of 110 on nonverbal and spatial tests. His analysis is flawed on 2 accounts. First, there is no generally accepted meaning of nonverbal intelligence. This imprecise concept is unsatisfactory because it can include any ability that is not verbal, including abstract reasoning, visualization, spatial, and perceptual abilities. Second, Vernon took no account of the secular increase of test norms that have the effect that groups tested with a test normed at some earlier date have inflated IQs. Flynn's analysis is better insofar as he adjusts IQs for secular increases in norms, but he also analyzes intelligence in terms of verbal and nonverbal IQs and averages these to produce an overall IQ. Flynn's conclusions are that American ethnic Chinese and Japanese have a verbal IQ of 95.3 and a nonverbal IQ of 99.6, and he averages these to give an overall IQ of 97.6. This is not a satisfactory analysis because nonverbal IQ is not accepted today as a meaningful concept. Furthermore, his use of the 2 concepts of verbal and nonverbal intelligence gives verbal ability the same weight as all other abilities in calculating general intelligence. And as East Asians are relatively weak, this spuriously reduces their IQ. General intelligence, or G, is best measured either from a test of nonverbal reasoning or from the average of verbal reasoning and visualization abilities. Despite this conceptual weakness, Flynn has performed a useful literature review and analysis, and in general I've adopted his estimates in the summary that follows. There is a problem with the studies of ethnic East Asians in the United States and elsewhere in that many of the samples have continued to speak Japanese, Chinese, or Korean as their first language, and have consequently performed poorly on verbal tests in English. In many cases, it is impossible to tell the extent of this handicap. Studies of ethnic East Asians in the United States are summarized in Table 10.2. Row 1 gives an IQ of 97 for Chinese children in San Francisco. They were tested with the Binet, which is a largely verbal test, and this probably handicapped the children, a number of whom will have spoken English as a second language. Row 2 gives a nonverbal reasoning IQ of 99 and a word knowledge IQ of 95 for Chinese children in Hawaii. Row 3 gives an IQ of 101 for Chinese and Japanese obtained in the standardization sample of the Drawman test. Rows 4 and 5 give IQs of 100 and 103 for Chinese and Japanese in Hawaii, tested with the Porteous mazes. Rows 6, 7, and 8 give IQs of 99, 101, and 102 for nonverbal reasoning for ethnic Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans in Honolulu compared with whites in the same location. The Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans scored substantially lower than whites on verbal tests. It is impossible to determine how far the low verbal IQs of the Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans were due to their speaking their own languages at home and consequently being handicapped on verbal tests in English, and how far they were due to the typical East Asian pattern of weaker verbal than reasoning abilities. Probably both factors were involved. Row 9 gives a verbal IQ of 96 for Japanese 18-year-olds interned during World War II, calculated by Flynn. 91% of the sample were second-generation immigrants and 8% third-generation immigrants. As with the Honolulu study, it is uncertain what percentage of these would have spoken Japanese in the home as their first language and hence have been handicapped on verbal tests in English. Row 10 gives a verbal IQ of 97 and a visualization IQ of 106 for a sample of ethnic Chinese 6-year-olds in New York. It is not certain whether some of these children spoke Chinese at home and were therefore handicapped on the verbal test. It is assumed that half of them were, and hence the verbal IQ is given only half the weight of the visualization IQ to estimate the general intelligence of 103. Row 11 gives IQs of 100 for reasoning and 97 for verbal ability for ethnic Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans from the nationwide Coleman study calculated by Flynn. The reasoning IQ is adopted as the figure for G. Row 12 gives a verbal IQ of 96 for ethnic Chinese and Japanese in Hawaii calculated by Flynn. Row 13 gives results for Japanese children in the island Kauai in the Hawaiian archipelago. The mean IQs were verbal, 107, spatial, 105, reasoning, 112, perception, 105, and number, 106. Flynn estimates that the norms of the test were obsolescent by 33 years, and therefore, that 10 points need to be deducted from the IQs. He arrives at a verbal IQ of 97 and a non-verbal IQ of 99% calculated as the average of the remaining 4 tests, and therefore a general overall IQ of 98%. The results are unusual in showing a relatively low IQ of 95 for spatial IQ. Row 14 gives an IQ of 99 and a verbal IQ of 95 for 17-year-olds in Los Angeles in 1969 to 1970, calculated by Flynn. Row 15 gives an IQ of 103 for ethnic Chinese in San Francisco, matched for socioeconomic status to whites, tested with a map understanding test described as a measure of spatial reasoning. In the same study, blacks also matched, with whites for socioeconomic status obtained an IQ of 90. Row 16 gives IQs of 101 for vocabulary and 102 for block design tests measured by the WISC in a nationwide survey, and averaged to 101 for G. Row 17 gives a nonverbal reasoning IQ of 98 and a verbal IQ of 99 derived from tests of information in English language obtained from a nationwide survey and calculated by Flynn. The higher verbal than reasoning IQ is unusual, and so contrary to the usual East Asian higher reasoning than verbal pattern that the result may be unreliable. Row 18 gives a WISC performance nonverbal IQ of 101 and a WISC verbal IQ of 91 for a small sample of 9-year-olds in San Francisco's Chinatown calculated by Flynn. The children attended Chinese private schools, and their low verbal IQ is probably attributable to many of the children speaking Chinese both at school and at home. The performance IQ is therefore adopted as the best measure of their general intelligence. Row 19 gives an IQ of 101 for a Chinese sample in California. Row 20 gives an IQ of 99 from various studies collected by Seoul and synthesized by Flynn. The tests given are not identified and are entered as measures of G. Row 21 gives an IQ of 107 obtained from the test of mathematical skills for a large sample of Japanese adolescents in Hawaii, compared with a sample of 3,722 Europeans also in Hawaii. Row 22 gives an IQ of 101 for Chinese children in California, collected by Jensen in 1975 and analyzed by Flynn. Half the children were foreign-born, coming mainly from Hong Kong, which probably accounts for their low verbal IQ of 89. Row 23 gives results collected by Jensen from an affluent district in Berkeley, California, calculated by Flynn. Both the Chinese and Japanese and the white children scored high. The figures entered in the table are Flynn's estimates for the East Asian children scored against national norms. In relation to white children in the same district, the East Asian children obtained IQs of 98% for reasoning and 95% for verbal IQ. The sample is not representative or satisfactory. Row 24 gives results for a Californian Chinese sample. Row 25 gives an IQ of 103 for a small but nationally representative sample of adolescents. Row 26 gives an IQ of 104 for American Asians from the standardization sample of the Differential Ability Scale. The 1980 American Census showed that approximately half of American Asians are East Asians consisting of ethnic Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and some Vietnamese. The remainder are mainly Filipinos, Vietnamese, Thais, Cambodians, and other Southeast Asians. Southeast Asians have IQs below Europeans, so the results shown in the table understate the intelligence of American East Asians. Row 27 gives an IQ of 109 for a small sample. Table 10.2. IQs of East Asians in the United States. Of East Asians obtained from the National Collaborative Perinatal Project collected in approximately 1966. The median IQ of the 9 studies in the first half of the 20th century is 101 and is a little lower than the median of 104 of the 9 studies, obtained from 1980 onwards, when it is almost exactly the same as the 105 of indigenous East Asians. There are 3 possible explanations for the increase in the intelligence of East Asians in the United States during the 20th century. The first is that many of those in the early studies spoke Chinese or Japanese as their first language and would have been handicapped on tests in English. Second, there may have been a tendency for the East Asians who migrated to the United States to have been a little below the average intelligence of those who remained in East Asia. The Chinese and Japanese who emigrated to the United States in the second half of the 19th century were largely peasants who came to do unskilled work on the construction of the railways and other building work. This would probably not seem an attractive option for the more intelligent who would generally have been doing sufficiently well in their own countries. Once these early migrants had settled in the United States, their children would have shown some regression upwards towards the East Asian mean of 105. Third, 5 of the studies contain measures of verbal and visualization abilities, and in 4 of these, the visualization IQ is greater than the verbal IQ. The mean difference between the 2 abilities is 4.4 IC points and is present in studies using a variety of tests. This confirms the pattern found in the samples of indigenous East Asians given in Table 10.1. 3. FERTBER studies of East Asians outside Northeast Asia. Studies of the intelligence of East Asians in locations outside Northeast Asia and the United States are summarized in Table 10.3. Row 1 gives an IQ of 99 for ethnic Japanese in Brazil. Row 2 gives an IQ of 107 for Japanese children in London. The actual IQ of this sample was 115, but the children's parents were largely businessmen, diplomats, and professional people of various kinds, so the IQ will be inflated. There are typically about 15 IQ points between the top and bottom socioeconomic classes, so the IQ of average Japanese children should be about 107. Rows 3 and 4 give IOS of 104 and 95 for early studies of Japanese and Chinese in Vancouver. According to Vernon, the Chinese immigrants were of poor peasant stock while the Japanese were from the skilled working class and middle class, and this explains why the Japanese performed better. Row 5 gives an IQ of 101 for a later study of Chinese in Vancouver. Rows 6 and 7 give results of 2 further studies of Chinese in Canada with IQs of 101 and 103. Row 8 gives an IQ of 99 for ethnic Chinese in Malaysia, and is 10 IQ points higher than that of Malays. The reason the IQ of the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia is a little lower than that of other East Asians in East Asia may be that they are relatively recent immigrants recruited to do unskilled work, and these immigrants may have been a little below the Chinese average. Row 9 gives a numerical reasoning IQ of 102 for the children of Chinese immigrants in the Netherlands. On verbal comprehension, their IQ was 85. But since they spoke Chinese as their first language, this cannot be regarded as valid. The median IQ of the 9 studies is 101, exactly the same as that of East Asians in the United States. 3 conclusions can be drawn from the studies of East Asians summarized in Table 10.3. First, their average IQs are a little higher than those of Europeans in similar environments. In Brazil, the IQ of 99% of ethnic Japanese is 4 IQ points higher than that of Europeans. The ancestors of these were recruited to work as agricultural laborers in the late 19th century, and these immigrants may have been a little below the Japanese average. In addition, their IQ and the IQ of 95% of Europeans in Brazil are both slightly depressed, probably partly because of the low living standards in Brazil. The median IQ of the 4 Canadian studies is 101. The median IQ of all the studies in the United States is 101. This is slightly higher than Flynn's estimate of 97.6, because Flynn omits the studies by Simmons, Goodenough, Feldman, United States, and the 4 last studies published after his analysis. Thus, the IQ of East Asians in the United States is a little lower than the 105 of East Asians in their own native habitats in East Asia. There are 4 possible reasons for this. The first is that those who migrated to the United States could have had slightly lower than average IQs than those who remained in Asia. This is possible because the East Asians in the United States and elsewhere outside East Asia are the descendants of immigrants who migrated to take unskilled, laboring jobs, and may well have been a little below the average intelligence of the populations from which they came. The second is that many of the Chinese and Japanese spoke Chinese and Japanese as their first language, and this would have handicapped their performance in some of the tests. Third, it may take 2 generations for immigrants from impoverished countries to overcome the effects of poor nutrition and reach their full potential. The mean IQ of the last 6 studies in Table 10.2, published from 1990 onwards, is 105, the same as that of East Asians in East Asia. Fourth, 3 of the studies contain measures of verbal and visualization abilities, and in all of these, the visualization IQ is greater than the verbal IQ. The mean difference between the 2 abilities is 7 IQ points. This confirms the low verbal high visualization pattern of abilities found in East Asia and the United States. A further study finding this ability pattern has been reported by Rushton in a sample of university students in Canada, in which East Asian students had a mean verbal IC of 112.8 and a mean performance IQ of 120.6. while European students had a mean verbal IQ of 117.7 and a mean performance IQ of 118.8. 4. East Asians adopted by Europeans. There have been 6 studies of the intelligence of East Asian infants adopted by European families in Europe and the United States. These are summarized in Table 10.4. Rows 1 through 3 give IQs of Korean children reared by white American adoptive parents. The sample was divided into 3 groups consisting of those who had been severely undernourished as infants, those who were poorly nourished, and those who were well nourished. The IQs of the 3 groups were related to their nutritional history. The severely undernourished group did not score significantly differently from American whites, but the other 2 groups scored higher. No details are given of the intelligence tests used to measure the IQs, which were obtained from school records and probably inflated by obsolete norms. Row 4 gives a verbal IQ of 115 for 25 largely East Asians, consisting of 12 from Vietnam, 10 from Korea, 3 from Cambodia, and 2 from Thailand. Rows 5 and 6 give the results of similar studies in Europe. Row 5 gives an IQ of 110 for Korean children adopted as infants in Belgium, and shows the usual higher visualization than verbal ability profile typically characteristic of East Asians. Row 6 gives an IQ of 108 for 36 Korean children who were adopted by Dutch families in the Netherlands. The mean of the 6 studies is an IQ of 109, and if the 2 first studies of malnourished infants is excluded, the mean is 111. One reason for this high figure is probably that these were young children adopted by largely middle-class families. It is known from the Weinberg-Scar and Waldman study that middle-class adoptive parents boost the IQs of their adopted children in early and middle childhood, but the effect fades away in late adolescence and adulthood. In this study, black infants adopted by white middle-class parents obtained a mean IQ of 95 at age 7. But this fell to 89 at age 17, indicating that being reared in white middle-class families boosts the childhood IC by 6 IQ points. Applying this result to the IQ of 112 of adequately nourished adopted East Asian children suggests that by adulthood their IQ would have declined by 6 IQ points, bringing it down to 106, virtually the same as that of East Asians in East Asia and of the most recent studies of East Asians in the United States. The results for the adopted children in Belgium given in row 5 show once again the low verbal high visualization ability pattern of East Asians present in East Asia, the United States, and elsewhere. This racial pattern has been found so consistently in such a variety of locations that it appears to be a genetic difference. 5. East Asian European hybrids. In Chapter 4, we saw considerable evidence that the intelligence of African-European hybrids is intermediate between that of Africans and Europeans. It might be expected that the intelligence of East Asian European hybrids would likewise be intermediate between that of the 2 parent races. The only study on this issue is that of Rushton in an analysis of the data of the American National Collaborative Perinatal Project. This consists of a study of 53,043 infants, for whom information of various kinds was collected at birth, in infancy, and at the age of 7 years, when data were collected for IQ measured by the whisk and head circumference. The IQs and brain size of East Asians, East Asian European hybrids, Europeans and African Americans at age 7 are shown in Table 10.5. Row 1 gives the numbers of children. Row 2 gives the mean IQs as reported. Row 3 gives the IQs adjusted for the secular increase of test norms. From 1949, the year of the standardization of the WES-C, to 1966, the median year of the collection of the data, and requiring the deduction of 5 IQ points from the reported IQs. Row 4 gives the brain size in cubic centimeters estimated from head circumference. Notice that for all 3 measures, the East Asian European hybrids fall intermediate between the East Asians and the Europeans. The fact that they fall closer to the Europeans is explicable because 5 of the cases were East Asian African hybrids. Table 10.5. IQs and brain size of East Asian European hybrids. 6. Reaction times. Reaction times consist of the speed of reaction to a simple stimulus, such as the onset of a light. Many studies have shown that reaction times are positively related to intelligence at a magnitude of around 0.2 to 0.3, and it has been argued by Jensen that reaction times are a measure of the neurological efficiency of the brain in processing information. We saw in Chapter 4 that Africans have slower reaction times than Europeans consistent with their lower IQ. We consider now whether East Asians have faster reaction times than Europeans consistent with their higher IQs. 3 studies of this issue are summarized in Table 10.6. In all 3 studies, the reaction times shown are the average of 3 reaction time tasks consisting of simple reaction times, choice reaction times, and odd man reaction times. Row 1 compares Japanese and British 9-year-olds. The IQ of the Japanese children was 110 or 0.66D higher than that of the British children, while their reaction times were 0.5% zeroed higher than those of British children. Row 2 gives results for a similarly designed study comparing Chinese children in Hong Kong with white British children. The IQ of the Chinese children was 122, or 1.3% higher than that of the British children, while their reaction times were 0.9% 6D higher than those of British children. Row 3 gives results for a further study of ethnic Chinese children in California, compared with 77 European children. The Chinese scored 6 IQ points, or 0.4% higher than the white children on intelligence, and 0.254% higher on the average of the 3 reaction time tests. The results of all 3 studies show that the magnitude of the advantage of East Asian children in reaction times representing the neurological efficiency of the brain in simple information processing is about 2/3 of their advantage in intelligence. These studies also reported differences in reaction time variability and in movement times, and these were of approximately the same magnitude as those of the reaction times. Jensen provides a more detailed description and discussion of these studies. Geary et al. Have also reported faster reaction times and higher IQs in Chinese as compared with American children, but they do not give standard deviations, so the difference cannot be expressed as a D. Table 10.6. Differences between East Asians and Europeans in reaction times. 7. Visual memory. Visual memory is not normally tested in intelligence tests. There have been 4 studies of the visual memory of the Japanese, the results of which are summarized in Table 10.7. Row 1 gives a Japanese IQ of 107 for 5 to 10-year-olds on the MFFT, calculated from error scores compared with an American sample, numbering 2,676. The MFFT consists of the presentation of drawings of a series of objects, for example, a boat, hen, etc., that have to be matched to an identical drawing among several that are closely similar. The task entails the memorization of the details of the drawings in order to find the perfect match. Performance on the task correlates 0.38 with the performance scale of the WISC, so that it is a weak test of visualization ability and general intelligence, as well as a test of visual memory. Row 2 gives a visual memory IQ of 105 for ethnic Japanese Americans compared with American Europeans on 2 tests of visual memory consisting of the presentation of 20 objects for 25 seconds and then removed, and the task was to remember and rearrange their positions. Row 3 shows a visual memory IQ of 110 obtained by comparing a sample of Japanese high school and university students with a sample of 52 European students at University College Dublin. Row 4 shows a visual memory IQ of 113 for the visual reproduction subtests of the Wechsler Memory Scale Revised obtained from the Japanese standardization of the test compared with the American standardization sample. The test involves the drawing from memory of geometric designs presented for 10 seconds. The authors suggest that the explanation for the Japanese superiority may be that Japanese children learn kanji, the Japanese ideographic script, and this develops visual memory capacity. However, this hypothesis was apparently disproved by the Flaherty and Connolly study, whose results are shown in row 2. Some of the ethnic Japanese American participants had a knowledge of kanji, while others did not, and there was no difference in visual memory between those who knew and those who did not know kanji, disproving the theory that the advantage of East Asians on visualization tasks arises from their practice on visualizing ideographic scripts. Table 10.7. Differences between East Asians and Europeans in visual memory, brain size. Studies of differences in brain size between East Asians and Europeans are summarized in Table 10.8. The means and standard deviations are for brain volume in cubic centimeters. Row 1 gives the results calculated by Gould from the collection of skulls assembled in the early 19th century by the American physician Samuel Morton, who categorized them by race and calculated their average cranial capacities. Gould accused Morton of mistakes and remeasured the skulls, proving to his own satisfaction that the East Asians and Europeans had the same brain size. However, the number of skulls was very low, consisting of 10 East Asians and 52 Europeans, and is so few that little weight can be attached to it. They are given here largely for historical interest. Row 2 gives results from the largest collection of skulls ever collected, numbering approximately 20,000, and shows that the East Asians had a larger brain size than the Europeans by 1.2D. Row 3 gives a difference of 20 cc's from a study of American 7-year-old children carried out by Broman, Nichols, Shaughnessy, and Kennedy. The brain sizes have been calculated from their data by Rushton. Row 4 gives the results of data assembled by Juergens, Ahn, and Pieper for many thousands of 25 to 45-year-olds. The figures in the table have been adjusted for body size by Rushton. Row 5 gives the results of a dataset assembled by Groves by combining estimates of cranial capacities of 36 samples of males from figures given by Kuhn, Molnar, and Martin, and Soller. The brain sizes are larger than in row 2 because they are for men, but the European Northeast Asian difference is similar, although slightly larger. Row 6 gives Rushton's results for brain size adjusted for body size for 6,325 United States military personnel. Row 7 gives Rushton's summary of a large number of data sets for brain size adjusted for body size. Thus, all the studies except Morton's, revised by Gould shown in row 1, have found that the East Asians have larger average brain size than Europeans. Table 10.8. Brain size differences of Europeans and East Asians. 9. Heritability of intelligence in East Asians. Only one study has been published on the heritability of intelligence in East Asians. This reports correlations of 543 identical and 134 non-identical twin pairs, aged 12 years, for a composite of 23 tests. The correlation was 0.782 for the identical twins and 0.491 for the non-identical twins. The heritability is obtained by doubling the difference between the two correlations and is 0.582, corrected for test reliability, and assuming a reliability coefficient of 0.9, the heritability becomes 0.65. This is about the same as the heritability for Europeans at this age, as shown in Chapter 3, Section 4, and it can be reasonably assumed that the heritability of intelligence in Europeans and East Asians is approximately the same. 10. Environmental and genetic explanations of the East Asian I.O. The consistently high IQs obtained by East Asians in their indigenous habitats in East Asia and in Europe and the Americas have presented a problem for environmentalists. These have found it relatively easy to explain the low IQs of Africans that they could ascribe to poverty, poor education, test bias, and racism. None of these can explain the lower IQ of Europeans compared with East Asians. Environmentalists have adopted 3 strategies to deal with this problem. The first is to ignore it. This is the solution adopted in most general textbooks and in specialist books on race and intelligence by Fish, Gould, and Montague. The second strategy is to dispute or belittle it. Thus, shortly after the first study of the high IQ of the Japanese on the Whiskar was published, Stevenson and Azuma contended that the Japanese standardization sample underrepresented lower IC groups. Later, as more studies were published confirming the high IQ of the Japanese, it was no longer possible to dispute it, so environmentalists contended that the difference was only small. Thus, Brody writes of the studies finding that intelligence in Japan is higher than in the United States. There is little or no evidence that there are large differences in IQ between these groups. He does not specify what he means by large. In similar vein, McIntosh writes there is no good reason to believe that Chinese or Japanese seriously outscore whites on intelligence tests. He does not specify what he means by seriously. The third strategy adopted by environmentalists is to contend that even if it is conceded that East Asians have higher IQs than Europeans, there is no evidence to decide whether such differences are environmental or genetic in origin. Contrary to this contention, the studies summarized in this chapter point to a strong genetic determination of the higher IQ of East Asians as compared with Europeans. First, there is the consistency of the higher IQs of the East Asians than those of the Europeans in so many different locations, including China, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Hong Kong. Second, the high IQs obtained by East Asians in their native lands are in general confirmed by studies of East Asians outside East Asia, summarized in Table 10.2. In the United States, the median IQ of East Asians derived from all the studies is 101, a little lower than the 105 of indigenous East Asians in East Asia. There are two possible reasons for this. The first is that those who migrated to the United States could have had slightly lower than average IQs than those who remained in Asia. The second is that the first and second generations of immigrants generally continue to speak their own languages and English as a second language. This may handicap them in language tests. The mean IQ of the last 6 studies in Table 10.2 published from 1990 onwards is 105, the same as that of East Asians in East Asia. In Table 10.3 we see that East Asians consistently obtain slightly higher average IQs than Europeans in similar environments. In Brazil, the IQ of 99% of ethnic Japanese is 4 IQ points higher than that of Europeans, although the Japanese were brought in to work as agricultural laborers after the abolition of slavery in 1888 and are unlikely to have had higher IQs than the general population in Japan. In Britain, East Asians obtained an IQ of 107, and in the Netherlands an IQ of 102. In Malaysia they obtain an IQ of 99, 10 IQ points higher than that of the indigenous Malays. Third, environmentalists do not offer any explanation for the consistently high IQ of East Asians, and it is doubtful whether any credible environmental explanation can be found. Intelligence is affected by living standards, but the living standards of a number of East Asians have been lower than those of Europeans. The East Asians of Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore enjoy comparable living standards to those of Europeans in Northern and Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but the living standards of those in China, South Korea, and Taiwan have been much lower, yet their IQs are about 5 IQ points higher than those of Europeans. The difference is consistently present, and there is no plausible environmental explanation for the East Asian superiority. Fourth, the 6 studies of the intelligence of Korean infants adopted by European families in Europe and the United States, summarized in Table 10.04, all show that these children have higher IQs than those of the Europeans in whose environment they have been reared. It seems improbable that these infants given up for adoption were a selective sample with higher than average IQs. It should, however, be noted that these children were quite young and would probably have been adopted largely by middle-class families that would have given them some environmental advantage. Just how large this effect is likely to have been is difficult to assess, but it is unlikely that it can have been as much as the 11 IQ point advantage of the 4 adequately nourished samples of adopted East Asians. In the Weinberg, Scar, and Waldman study summarized in Section 13 of Chapter 4, it was shown that black infants adopted by white middle-class families obtained an IQ of 95 at age 7 and of 89 at age 17, suggesting that the environmental advantage for the 7-year-olds was 6 IQ points. Applying the same rule of thumb to the adopted East Asian children, the mean IQ of the adequately nourished samples of 111 should be reduced by 6 IQ points to give a true IQ of 105, precisely the same as that of indigenous East Asians. Fifth, The faster reaction times of East Asian children, shown in Table 10.6, indicate that they have a more efficient neurological processing system that makes a significant contribution to their higher IQs, and again, this superiority in reaction times cannot be plausibly explained environmentally. Sixth, several studies summarized in Table 10.8 have shown that East Asians have a larger average brain size than Europeans. Brain size is a significant neurological determinant of intelligence, and brain size has a high heritability. It is doubtful whether any environmental explanation is possible for the larger brain size of East Asians. It can be estimated that their larger brain size should give East Asians a 10 IQ point advantage. This is the one Guatemalan Quetzal advantage that they would be expected to have by virtue of their larger brain size if they were reared in the same environments as Europeans. As the IQ of Europeans has been estimated as 99, and the IQ of East Asians as 105, the actual IQ difference between them is 6 IQ points. Two explanations can be offered for the fact that the actual East Asian advantage is only 6 IQ points, while the predicted advantage is 10 IQ points. First, some of the larger East Asian brain may be devoted to their higher visual memory, which is not measured in intelligence tests. Second, many of the samples were conceived and reared in poorer environments with lower living standards than those of Europeans, and these may have had some depressing effect on their IQs. If this is so, when the living standards of East Asia become equal to those of Europeans, it can be predicted that the IQ difference will become 10 IQ points and will be explicable in terms of the brain size difference.